Congratulations, Philip Roth.
Thank you.
For more than half a century now, you have been the most protean of American fiction writers. The talented comic performer of Goodbye Columbus, your first book, gives way to the Jamesian craftsman of Letting Go and When She Was Good, your second and third books. And that Philip Roth gives way in turn to the outlandish farceur of Portnoy's Complaint, and it only gets more interesting from there. In the 70s, we meet David Keppish and Peter Tarnopol, and then in the 80s, the great sequence of Zuckerman novels begins. I wonder, looking back on this metamorphic career, this series of transformations, what it's like for you to reread your books. Was it a feeling of dissatisfaction with what you'd accomplished that was driving you forward?
What was driving me forward, certainly in the beginning, was trying to figure out two things. One, how to write a novel. After all, no one had taught me that in school. And two, where my talent was. I didn't know that either. And so I wrote 3 or 4 books at the beginning, each very different from the other, not so as to show off my expertise, but rather trying to figure out where I could be strongest. What kind of subject would stir my verbal energy, and what I sounded like on the page. I didn't know that. After that, things did change from time to time, and I found myself, I guess, writing one book in response to another. To give you one example, I would say, is 2 books that appeared successively back in the 1990s were Sabbath Theater and American Pastoral. Sabbath Theater is a Hell's a Poppin' book, has a very comical and mean main character. And when I finished that book, I'd had it with that, and I wanted to write about a good man. The opposite of my hero in Sabbath Theater. And so I came up with Lvov, the hero of American Pastoral. Now, many more things went into it, of course, having to do primarily with subject, but I did bounce from one onto the other, yeah. I think what may happen is that when you finish certainly a long book, that you stage a rebellion against that book and write a different kind of book next.
You once said that you feel the counterlife was in particular an important moment of renewal for you. I wonder if you can think back to that moment.
Counterlife was written and published in the 1980s. Yes, I had this character named Zuckerman, who was the hero of a kind of comic quartet of books, beginning with Ghost Rider and going on to the Prague Orgy. And he seemed useful to me, but I only began to really use his intelligence usefully in writing The Counterlife. And he began to be the mediating intelligence through which I could tell the story, as opposed to the major actor in the story. And that led me to do American Pastoral, I Married a Communist, and Human Stain, in which there again he's the mediating intelligence, and he freed me.
When and why did history become a theme for you?
I suppose in the middle 80s when I wrote The Counterlife. Why? I don't know what happened. History, it isn't so much history that became important as place became important. And I wanted to see what people were like in these different places. London for one, Israel for another, Prague for a third. And so place entered in, and then history, yes. Why? Because I'd gotten to be 50 or 60 years old, I think. And I could now look back on the time of my life with a historical perspective. You can't do that when you're young. And I think it was a mixture then of getting older and of being enlivened by certain places that I had been to.
We haven't yet spoken about the plot against America, a counter history.
Oh, the plot against America, the idea came to me from reading Arthur Schlesinger's first volume of his biography. There was only one volume, but it was the first. And in it, Schlesinger is writing about the 1940 presidential election in America, and he says that the far right would have liked to have Lindbergh as their candidate. And that's all. It's a half a sentence. I remember noting in the margin while I was reading, why not? And then I had lunch with Arthur, and I said, tell me about the far right and Lindbergh. And I began to get interested in the possibility of a book like The Plot Against America, and then imagined Lindbergh becoming the President of the United States. And then I had to imagine a family who felt the extreme right-wing lash on their backs. And so I thought, why not my own family? And so I tried to make the people in the book behave the way I imagined my immediate family, mother, father, and brother, would have behaved in this situation. So on the one hand, the book is far out, and it imagines Lindbergh as the President of the United States. And on the other hand, it's far in, because it imagines my family as being the victims.
Since that big book, you've written a final Zuckerman volume, Exit Ghost, and also 4 nemesis. Can you say something about the nemesis?
About 10 years ago, I guess, I began to think about a short novel and short novels, and read quite a few. And Bella was alive then, and Saul had written 3 or 4 interesting short novels near the end of his life. And so I asked him, how do you do it? And he did what Saul did. He laughed. So I started to do it. And it's strange because you're fighting with one hand tied behind your back. How do you get the punch, the knockout punch, into this short book? How do you do it? I had to try to find out. Maybe I found out and maybe I didn't. I don't know.
Were you one of those people who knew from childhood you wanted to be a writer?
No, I didn't know what a writer was. I knew what books were because I would go to the branch library in our neighborhood to get books, following the example of my brother, who'd done it before, and come home with half a dozen books and read them. But they were kids' books. There were books about sports, books about the sea, which I was somehow interested in. But I didn't know what an author was. I learned what an author was, I guess, in college, because I began to read my second year of college and taking literature courses, and I was overcome. I was overcome. I entered college as somebody about to study law, and I assumed I would do that. I'd taken constitutional history in college, political science, and so on. And then I discovered literature, and I was overcome, and that did it. And then I suppose by my last year, I wanted to write. I wrote college stories. They were as weak as anybody's college stories. And only a few years later, after graduate school, when I was drafted and went into the Army, I had an office job in the Army, and at night I went back to the office and there was a typewriter there. And I began to write the first stories that were okay. So it wasn't something I knew about, thought about doing, and even when I began to do it, I thought I'll never make a living from this. Very few did make a living then, and very few make a living now. I thought I'll need a job, and so I'll teach English. I'll be an English teacher, English professor, and then I'll write in those 4 or 5 months of the summer and so on. And that was my plan. And then I won a prize, the National Book Award for Goodbye Columbus, and I got a Guggenheim grant for $3,200, and I was on Easy Street.
How was your stint in the Army?
My stint in the Army? It was memorable only for one thing. I didn't mind it, actually. It's fun to learn how to shoot a machine gun, you know, use a bayonet. I hurt my back and eventually wound up in the hospital for 2 months and eventually was discharged. So, and then I've had back trouble off and on. It might have been more interesting had I been in longer, but that was enough. I got the idea.
When you take up these themes of recent books, say the Korean War or the perils of the polio, am I right that you do a lot of research, or are you simply remembering?
I do my remembering while I'm writing. Usually I don't turn to the books until after I've got a first draft of my story. Why? I don't want to be caged in by the reality, as it were. I want my imagination to go wherever it wants to go. If it's outlandish, if I find from the reading that what I've written is outlandish, then of course I can get rid of it. But after the first or second draft, then I do begin to read books and talk to people. Say to go up to The Plot Against America, there's a cousin in the book, I forget his name now, and one of the Roth family's cousins, and he loses a leg in the war, and he sleeps with young Philip in his bedroom, and he has a stump and so on. And I found somebody who had a stump, and I could talk to him about how he got it, what it's been like to live with it. He let me touch it, which is amazing. I also walked on his crutches. Terrific fellow. And it was helpful. It was helpful. It may not be that you use what the person says to you, though you might, but that it stimulates you in the right direction. It launches your imagination in the right direction. So recently, when I had a kosher butcher in one of the books, Indignation, you'd think it'd be easy not to have to consult books to write about a kosher butcher shop. But I did. I found some interesting books about koshering meat. And then I went over to Brooklyn, and I found someone had told me where to go, a few kosher butcher shops, and I went in and I walked around and I talked to the guy and so on. Of course, I've been in kosher butcher shops as a kid, but I didn't remember what it smelled like.
These historically based books have sometimes, I gather, brought you poignant and sometimes uncanny letters from readers who were enmeshed in the events you described, polio or the details of a summer camp in that era, or veterans of the Korean War and so on. I'm curious about some of the remarkable letters you might have received.
The best and most interesting letters come from people who want to talk about the subject of the book. And very often it's because they've been through a similar, they've lived in a similar milieu or been through a similar hardship, and so on. Most recently, because of the publication of Nemesis, I have gotten, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6 letters from polio victims. They're usually, they've all been men. They're men about my age, because polio stopped victimizing people in 1955 in America. So they all got their polio before that as youngsters. And they're heartfelt, they're descriptive, they make me feel validated in what I wrote, you know. Yes, I read those letters with zest because they're talking to what I'm talking about. Yeah.
May I ask you in particular about writers who, in retrospect, you realize now shaped you? There was a phase in your career when you were interested above all in Kafka, for example.
Mm-hmm. There are some writers who made an indelible impression. I don't know if they shaped me as a writer. They shaped me as a reader and as a thinker, and as a literary person. If they shaped me as a writer, I don't know. When I first started out, I was fresh from graduate school, where I'd been steeped in Henry James, and there was an influence, in quotation marks, not all for the good, and there was a tone that I picked up from James which didn't suit me at all, but it's there in letting go. I think it's best when that doesn't happen, but rather when your literary consciousness is expanded as you go through life by people like Kafka. Kafka was made a very strong impression on me. These serious comedies of guilt touched me, so I think that Kafka back in the 1970s, when I was also teaching and I taught a lot of Kafka, I just was with a master. That's the wonderful thing, to my mind, about teaching, is that in order to teach a book, you've got to read it very carefully and figure out a way of talking about it, figure out language to describe it, and you become intimate. You have an intimate involvement, as intimate an involvement as you can have with someone like Kafka. I think Bellow, of course, has been a major figure in my imagination and in my mind all my life as a writer. Saul was born in 1918? 1915. Born in 1915, so he was 18 years older than I was. So therefore he was a figure of awe for me. But I read that when I got out to Chicago in 1955 to begin to go to the University of Chicago graduate school, I read Augie March, and Augie March was my guidebook. I read it like Fodor's Guide to Chicago, you know. And also it was so glamorous, it seemed to me, that I should be in this city, that nourishes this guy. And so I read Bellow's books as soon as they came out, each book, and I taught a lot of Bellow too. In fact, I had a course which I taught for several years called Kafka and Bellow, the hunger artist and the opposite, you know, the abundant artist, the superabundant artist. For a while, when I was starting out, Malamud made a strong impression on me. He and Bellow made a strong impression at the same time, in about 1955-56, because they were Jews. I was a Jew. They were Jews, and they didn't turn away from the material that had been given to them. They didn't try to write like Lord Chesterfield, you know, and they, to put it mildly. And I could do the same with my stuff, and I could do my best to make my Newark into what Malamud made his Brooklyn into, what Bellow made his Chicago into. It took me a while to figure that out. In Goodbye Columbus, Newark is just sketched in. I didn't know what I was doing. But later on, when you get to American Pastoral, I think it lives. And I learned that in a way from Bellow.
University of Chicago was altogether a good thing in your life. That was 2 years, right?
I took a year at a master's degree, and I taught there for 2 years. So I was there for 3 years in the 1950s, middle 50s. I loved the University of Chicago. I'd gone to a small mediocre college. I happened to get a very good, rigorous literary education there, but it was still a small rural college. And this was in a great city, and it had a great faculty, and it had very, very smart students. Yes, I enjoyed it. I often, in years later, wondered why I'd left Chicago to go to New York when I got an $800 paycheck from Esquire magazine to go to New York to make my fortune. And because I liked the city, the neighborhood, and the university. But that's what I did.
Well, that training at Bucknell sounds formidable to me. I wonder if you can say something about the teachers you had there.
Bucknell was a very small school when I was there. I don't think there were more than 2,000 students, if that many. And the mood was decorous and polite. As if the 50s weren't decorous and polite enough, then you went to Bucknell, it was even more decorous and polite. But that aside, I happened to land in the English department, and there were 4, maybe 5 first-class young professors. And the scheme for English majors was very rigorous. And it was great. I read a lot in English literature, but no American literature at all. But I read everything. I had to write about everything. That was the way they did it. You had to write a summary of the thing, which is a good exercise, and then a critique of the thing, whatever it was. And by the time I got out of there, I knew how to read. And I knew a lot of stuff about English literature. So it served me well. It was right for me then to go on to a big place like Chicago, a big sophisticated place, intellectually sophisticated. But this was fine for a kid. Yeah.
Has the theater ever tempted you, as it did Henry James, as it has a number of American fiction writers?
In the middle 60s, the Ford Foundation had a program to try to interest novelists and poets in writing plays. I got a grant from them for whatever it was to try to write a play. And you were also affiliated with a theater. Each person was affiliated with a different theater. So you could see plays being produced, and you could have your own play if you wrote it, read or produced. And nobody has ever written worse plays than me. Maybe Henry James, doesn't matter. But I couldn't figure it out. Maybe there is no way to figure it out, and that's why there are so few good plays. But I couldn't figure it out, and I couldn't get anything that resembled mind or mentalness into the play. Everybody, anyway, it goes without saying, everybody was stupid. It doesn't make any difference. But I did that for about 2 or 3 years, and it didn't work for me.
Among your exact contemporaries, there was John Updike, whose career runs alongside yours. I think the year you won the National Book Award, he won the Rosenthal Award. Mm-hmm. And you were very often contrasted along the way. Well, you were yourself a reader of Updike.
Yeah, John is dead now 2 years, and I slightly suspect that if he were alive, he would be sitting in this chair and not me. And that would have been a good idea. He was a master. He was a great American master. Surely the greatest man of letters of his period, the second half of the 20th century. And a brilliant writer. He could write any kind of sentence imaginable. You just ask for it and he'd give it to you. His 2 great books, to my mind, though he wrote quite a few great books, the 2 greatest books are the last 2 of the Rabbit books. Rabbit is Rich and Rabbit at Rest. He's free as a bird. He can go anywhere. He can do any kind of comedy. He can do any kind of description. He's just free. He's completely free. The freest he was always free, but this is the freest he would ever be, I think. because he was so certain about the material, that is Rabbit in central Pennsylvania, and his fluency, fluidity was all there. And as I said, he had his subject in his hand, you know. So he was a great writer.
Eastern Europe from the 1970s to the end of the Cold War was a particular interest of yours, both as the editor of an important series of translated books in America and in your own work. Could you say something more about that?
Yeah, I kind of stumbled upon Eastern Europe as an interest. In 1972, in the spring, I went on a trip and I included Prague in it because I'd never seen it. And so I was only there for 3 days, I think. But while I was there, I met my translators. They had translated Portnoy's complaint, and they couldn't get it published because there was now a Russian-backed totalitarian regime in the driver's seat in Prague. But they told me about how awful things were, and they and several other people began to introduce me to writers. Among them Milan Kundera and Ivan Klima and Ludwig Vaculek and Miroslav Holub, the poet, and so on. And Jiří Mucha, who wasn't a dissident, but he was a good writer. And I began to go back annually for about a week or two to see all these people. I thought there was a lot of talent there that we knew nothing about, and that it would do everybody some good if those books were put into print, because it might furnish some little protection for those who were vulnerable to the government and the police. And so with the aid of Penguin Books, I edited a series called Writers from the Other Europe, and there were some first-class books in there. And then the series broadened out to have a book by called This Way for the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen, by Borowski and Bruno Schulz. Bruno Schulz was published almost for the first time in that series, his 2 books of stories, and it was very impressive. And my life, I had many Czech exile friends during that period. I wound up eating in many Czech restaurants, and they made my life very interesting.
Thank you so much, and again, congratulations.
Thank you.